And without the Russian collapse, I don't see how Putin can come to the table even for serious negotiations yet.
And he could see Putin as a weak old man.
Putin is losing control of the war, he's losing control of the narrative, and he's looking weaker and weaker. Yeah, and Trump will see that, certainly the Europeans see that. There's a real danger of looking at the war in Ukraine and saying, well, Russia's not made a lot of progress, therefore Russia is weak.
Yes.
That's a real, that is very dangerous logic. One thing I hear a lot is, come on, Russia can't even beat Ukraine. You know, what threat is it to Europe? And that is really dangerous thinking, again, you know, because Ukraine is far stronger than any other military in Europe, so that's one factor. And then the other factor is they don't have to defeat NATO. All they have to do is expose the fact that NATO will not live up to its collective security guarantees, and then NATO ceases to exist. Europe should definitely be involved in the talks because Europe's future is at stake here, Europe's security is at stake. They should definitely be involved in discussing the broad settlement.
Welcome to Channel 24. My name is Nataliia Lutsenko and my guest today is Peter Dickinson. He is an editor of UkraineAlert at the Atlantic Council. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you here finally, officially. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Peter, I want to elaborate on a few issues and questions. And first of all, it's a summit that just happened in France of a G7. What are your takeaways from the summit, for Ukraine especially? Have you heard any positive notes about the air defense and possible sanctions on Russia, again from the United States, and etc.?
Well, I think the main takeaway from Ukraine's point of view is that Ukraine was the top of the agenda. It was very much the center of attention. There was a special session on Ukraine. President Zelenskyy was there as one of the most high-profile guests. So, you know, Ukraine was at the very center, at the very top of the agenda. That's key, I think. And it was also central to discussions between the Europeans and the Americans. So that's encouraging. That's certainly what you'd want to have. But I would be cautious about some of the more optimistic reports that we've seen since the summit that are suggesting that there's been a big shift in America's position, that President Trump has changed his mind, that he's now aligned himself with the Europeans. You know, we've been here before. You know, we keep going through this cycle of sort of highs and lows with Trump, and then people get very depressed, and then he says something and people say, okay, maybe he's seen the light, and then we go back to where we were before. So, I mean, I think we've got to be realistic in our expectations here. The main goal, I would say, from a European point of view with Trump is to sort of prevent him going too far toward the Russian side. I don't think that there's any real hope of him becoming a very strong supporter of Ukraine, or for that matter, a strong supporter of Europe in its relationship, in its attempts to stop Russia. It's all about really sort of containing him and containing the damage that he can cause. Let's see what comes out of it. But I'd be cautious about this talk of Trump now getting in line with Europeans and supporting Ukraine, but at the same time, certainly encouraging that Ukraine was the center of attention.
But it seems like Donald Trump is bringing Russia's war in Ukraine again into his focus.
Yeah, I mean, this is good. Again, that's encouraging. But yeah, we've got to be realistic about who Donald Trump is and what he is. You know, he is fundamentally, he's pro-Russian. I mean, he's probably more to the point, he's pro-Putin. He admires Putin. He'd like to have a close relationship with Putin. And at the same time, he has, you know, pretty thinly veiled contempt for Europe and also for Ukraine. He has some sort of animosity towards President Zelenskyy personally, dating back to his first impeachment. I think he has he's indifferent to these ideas of democracy and sovereignty. He really doesn't see that as a big issue. He's a man who deals in power. Putin is for him a powerful man. He admires that very much. You know, there's no question about that. So we shouldn't expect him to swing too far on the Ukrainian side. You know, let's just hope he doesn't go too far on the Russian side.
But at least he doesn't say right now that we don't have any cards.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I think, or one of the big things that Ukraine has in its favour in relation to Trump is that he likes winners. He hates losers and he likes winners. And right now, Ukraine looks like a winner. And so it's very difficult for Trump to go against them. And he sees which way the wind is blowing. He sees that, you know, we just saw in America recently the Congress, the House of Representatives passed the Ukrainian support bill when a significant number of Republican congressmen voted together with the Democrats to pass that bill. Now, that's unlikely to pass the Senate, and Trump can also veto it. So it's not going to be necessarily taken through to conclusion and become law. But it sends a very strong signal to Trump that even within his own party, there's a lot of people who don't like what's happening in terms of America's position with Ukraine. They don't like his policy toward Russia, and they are prepared to go against him publicly. So that was a signal. American public opinion also sends the same signal. He sees what the Europeans are saying, and he's getting reports from his own military who are telling him Ukraine is doing very well. They're doing much better. Russia's doing badly. They're not getting anywhere near toward the victory that Putin talks about. Putin's been creating imaginary victories basically and lying essentially about his prospects. So Trump sees all that and he understands. He doesn't want to be on the side of the losers.
Yeah, okay. You saying that he's pro-Russia? No, you saying he's a pro-Putin.
Pro-Putin, and there's a distinction.
Yes, yeah. Okay, Peter. But at the same time, looking at this, because at the moment we are recording this interview, it's a huge day for Ukraine. We made one of the biggest attacks on Moscow city in Russia with the drones, with over 1,000 of drones on oil refineries. So, looking at this successful attacks on Russia, don't you think that at some point Donald Trump could see President Zelenskyy also as a strong leader and Russian dictator who actually not in Moscow right now? He just ran away somewhere. He's not even coming back to Moscow. And he could see Putin as a weak old man.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the perception that Zelenskyy is trying to create and is succeeding in creating. If we look at the last, we're now toward the end of June. If we go back the last 6-7 weeks to early May, we've had the Victory Day parade when Putin was forced to downgrade his own parade, his big parade, the biggest event of the year in Russia, his Victory Day parade. He basically had to downgrade it because he couldn't protect Moscow against Ukraine. And he went to Trump personally and said, can you help me negotiate with the Ukrainians, persuade them not to bomb my parade, which is a huge humiliation for any Russian leader, especially a strong man, a self-styled strong man like Putin. Then we had the Economic Forum in St. Petersburg at the beginning of June. Again, Putin's number 2 event of the year, probably. So Victory Day number 1, the Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, probably the number 2 event, his big international event. He invites everyone there. They've all gathered for the big event on the morning of the opening. They're all on their way to the event. What do they see? Huge plumes of smoke over St. Petersburg because, again, Ukraine has bombed his showpiece event. And then today's attack on Moscow, perhaps the most striking of all. If Russia can't protect the main oil refinery in the capital city, which has got to be in the top 20 probably strategic targets in the whole country, what can they defend? So the signals are very clear at the moment. Putin is losing control of the war, he's losing control of the narrative, and he's looking weaker and weaker. And Trump will see that. Certainly the Europeans see that. The Ukrainians see it, and perhaps most of all, the Russians see it because they know how to read between the lines. They understand now that they're being fed nonsense. Some of them may have not understood that before. Many of them probably already did, but now none of them can deny it. Like they are now having a real reckoning and they're saying, well, what the hell is going on here? Excuse my French. We're being bombed to pieces in Moscow here and we're being told that we're winning. There's a problem.
Yeah, that was actually, we were approaching my next question because Ukraine is sending over 300 drones to Russian cities every night almost. And I thought at what point Russian population will be really scared, especially Moscovites, the people living in Moscow. I think, they were treated like VIP people for decades. And so do you think they finally can be scared or they will adapt?
Well, I don't know if they'll be scared in terms of will they fear for their lives. We've got to bear in mind that Moscow is a country, essentially. It's a city of between 12 and 14 million people. It's a huge, huge territory. So even if there's a large attack on a certain point there, in this case, the oil refinery, it's a pinprick. There's a lot of people in Moscow today who won't even have noticed this. They won't have seen anything. They won't have heard anything. They'll have been going about their business and they'll be watching it on the news just as we are here. We've got to, keep that in mind. But what they will be seeing is fuel shortages at the petrol stations. They'll be seeing issues that will have a knock-on effect with the supplies in the shops. They will see that the airports are closed. The flights are, the airlines aren't flying. So there's going to be disruption and uncertainty across the board. Some people will be scared, but I say for most people, I think the overwhelming emotion will not be fear. It will be annoyance and disillusionment perhaps with what's going on, the questioning and saying, why are we doing this? This is really making my life difficult. Because the whole basis of Putin's unspoken agreement with Moscow, and you're right that Moscow is a very privileged caste in Russia. They are a separate, almost as a separate country. They are the imperial metropolis, and so you have the imperial metropolis in Moscow, and then the second metropolis in St. Petersburg. And then you have the rest of Russia, and they're basically two separate kingdoms, as it were. And the deal was always, I fight my war. It doesn't disturb you. You allow me to fight the war and support it if you want, and many of them did support it, but mostly it was like, it won't disturb your daily life. And now it is disturbing their daily life, and that's a hugely significant moment, because that was always, I say, the unspoken, but very much understood, I would say, in Russia, the contract between Putin and the Kremlin and the Russian people, the Muscovites. We will not disturb your daily life. We'll fight our war in Ukraine. We'll do whatever we want in Ukraine. You'll let us do it, but we won't disturb you. And now, well, they're being disturbed.
European leaders on the G7 were discussing a possibility of a suggestion to Donald Trump to arrange a meeting between, not arranged, but just to host a meeting between Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and Russian dictator Putin. From your perspective, is that even necessary, and is that ever happen?
Well, I think, could it happen? I mean, anything could happen. But I would say, I think the whole narrative of a meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin is all about trying to put pressure on Putin and to sort of reveal that he is the obstacle to peace. I don't think anyone, I can say with a great deal of confidence that nobody in Kiev expects Putin to meet Zelenskyy. They all understand it'll never happen. I think the Europeans understand that. I think Trump probably would like it to happen, but even he's starting to realize it's not going to happen, and there's good reasons for that. Putin cannot meet Zelenskyy because he would legitimize Zelenskyy by meeting him. And his whole position is Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is not a state. Ukraine is not a country. It's part of Russia. It should always be part of Russia. It's always been part of Russia. There is no such thing as a legitimate Ukrainian state. And there's certainly no such thing as a legitimate Ukrainian president. So he can't meet with Zelenskyy because that would legitimize him. And that's fundamental for Putin's position. And so I think what they're doing with these talk of these meetings, it's really a pressure point. It's really Ukraine saying, we're ready to meet. He's not ready to meet. Ergo, he is the problem. But there's no illusions, I think, that there's going to be a meeting. I mean, if you look at the Russian response is always, yeah, sure, come to Moscow, which they know is impossible. So it's essentially saying, they're basically saying no, but it also shows they're afraid to say no. They don't want to come out and just say, no, we won't meet him. They say, yeah, sure, we're cool when we come to Moscow, because they know there's no way on earth that Zelenskyy can go to Moscow for a meeting, and that's obviously ridiculous. But they're afraid to come out and just say, no, we won't do it, because they understand what's at stake here. They understand that it's narrative. It's a battle of narratives, and essentially what Ukraine is doing is positioning Putin quite openly, I think, for the international community as the guilty party here.
There are some, rumors, speculation about the November and that the war could end this year in autumn. From your perspective, is that even possible? What is your sources are saying?
I mean, I'm not optimistic. I think one thing I would say immediately is that you never know with the Russians. They always look stronger they perhaps look stronger than they are and weaker they are at the same time. And when Russia does collapse, it's usually a surprise. No one was predicting a Russian collapse in 1916. Almost no one was predicting a Russian collapse in 1990, and yet it happened twice. So, history shows us that Russia does collapse, and a new Russian collapse would certainly not be beyond the realms of possibility. I mean, we shouldn't be shocked by that, and I think Putin is very, very afraid of that. But is it imminent? I don't know. I don't see any signs yet. Let's see. And without the Russian collapse, I don't see how Putin can come to the table even for serious negotiations yet. He's bet his entire reign on this invasion. Everything now hinges on him having a successful outcome of this war. At the moment, it's not successful. To have conquered 20% of Ukraine and to have left 80% of Ukraine now very, very much anchored in the West, very much part of Europe now, a very, very strong military, very, very strong sense of national identity, very, very strong anti-Russian sentiment. I mean, all these things are catastrophic for Russia. I mean, if that is the settlement, if Russia gets to keep the areas of Ukraine in the east and the south that essentially they've destroyed to a significant degree, ruins, essentially. You know, the cities of especially of East Ukraine is essentially rubble now. You know, and so if that's what they get, and then the rest of Ukraine, Odessa, you know, Kiev, Kharkiv, the whole country goes off over into the you know, across the horizon into Europe and into the West and so on. That's a defeat for Russia. There's no way you can portray that in any other sense. So I don't think that the Russians are ready yet to come to the peace table. I don't think Putin can, realistically. He'll fight on, although his situation is not looking good for sure. You know, we've got to get to the point where there's a lot more pressure on Putin, and we've got to get to the point where he fears that if he does continue the war, he won't just lose in Ukraine, he could lose Russia. He could face a real serious destabilization in Russia, and again, you know, a 1917, a 1991, a collapse of Russia. That's the only thing I think that will make him stop this war.
Peter, you're living in Ukraine for many years. You're living in Kyiv, and just days ago we've seen a massive Russian attack, and they attacked Ukrainian heritage, UNESCO, Kyiv-Pечерska Lavra. This is a saint place for many years for a lot of believers in Ukraine and in the world. What is your take on that one? Was it on purpose?
Yeah, in my opinion, it was certainly on purpose. And you know, if they hit one church, you would say that's an accident and that's a collateral damage. If they hit 10, you might say that. If they hit 100, you might argue it. They've hit 600 or 700 churches.
But
this is not an accident.
Lavra.
Well, but there's an escalation factor here. You know, I mean, I think they wanted to demonstrate this factor. I think that Putin is looking for ways to try. I mean, he's, you know, let's be frank here. On the front lines, the fighting is very heavy, so I don't want to downplay the significance of it, but they're not making advances. They're not making big advances. They're fighting over fields and villages and hamlets. You know, this is very small scale gains. And there's no real sense, as far as I can see, and I've not heard from any serious military analysts, that Russia is on the brink of a breakthrough or could realistically achieve a breakthrough in the near future. So the front lines are not going to bring Putin the victory. You know, so he's looking around and thinking, well, how can I somehow achieve a breakthrough? And all he can come up with, I think, is just to bomb Ukraine. You know, so he's bombing civilian targets, he's bombing residential buildings, and also now it would seem they're looking more and more to bomb symbolic targets. And the Lavra, of course, is, you know, one of the great symbolic targets in Ukraine. I think it was interesting as well that the target they chose in the Lavra was specifically the cathedral that was rebuilt by the Ukrainian state in 2000. That was reopened, it was rebuilt in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So it was, so to speak, the Ukrainian part of the Lavra in terms of the modern Ukrainian independent state. And, you know, I don't think, you know, again, there's a lot of coincidences there. That would be a hell of a coincidence. So, yeah, I don't believe in coincidences where Putin's concerned, where the Kremlin's concerned, and certainly not in this case. And again, this is part of their war. You know, they are attacking Ukrainian identity and heritage. This war is not about land. This is not about territorial gains. It's not even political. It's about establishing Russian dominance over Ukraine in a total sense, in terms of identity, language, culture, history, heritage, religion, the whole package. I mean, they want to erase Ukrainian identity, and you know, we see this happening in the occupied parts of Ukraine. They're wiping out Ukrainian identity. You know, so when they attack something like the Lavra, you know, I think we need to speak very clearly about that. People who are here in Ukraine and understand this, we need to speak to the international community and say, this is not collateral damage. This is not an accident. This is part of a war against Ukrainian identity.
Peter, I don't know whether you have seen the latest interview of Solovyov to Swiss journalists. Have you seen it?
No.
So it's an interview. I haven't heard him speaking in English, but he's apparently has a fine English. And he was talking to international journalists from Switzerland, a media outlet, and poor journalists, of course. But Solovyov was super emotional, and the messages he was sending to him. He's a psychiatric figure. He's not. We should not take him seriously. But still, he was sending some message before G7, I would say. So what he said is that the person who was in 2022 that loved Europe, and he used to live on Lake Como for a long time in Italy. This person died. Now the warrior is in front of you, and we hate you, and we destroy you. And Ukraine is just it's just a side effect of everything, because we're fighting not with Ukraine, we're fighting with the NATO and all those narratives. My point is, despite the fact that he's not a kind of a serious figure, but still he's serious for a Russian audience, what does he want with such messages? Maybe they're preparing their audience for something like, oh, well, Russia was fighting against NATO, that's why they collapsed.
Well, first of all, I would say I think he's a very serious figure. We shouldn't underestimate him. Just because the things he says are insane doesn't mean he's not serious. He's, in a dictatorship like Putin's, there are no real politicians. There's no politics in Putin's dictatorship. There are no political parties. There are no real. There are functionaries. There are administrators. So he actually occupies a very senior place in the establishment. Putin is the Tsar of Tsars. He's the king of kings. He rules everything. But below Putin, I would say that Solovyov is one of the figures who is very close to the pinnacle. They are one of the figures who really speaks to the Russian audience and speaks for the Russians, at least speaks for the establishment. So I wouldn't underestimate how important he is just because what he says is completely insane. In this context, I think, it could be that he's preparing, again, he's speaking to a Swiss journalist, but he's primarily speaking to the Russian people. He's primarily speaking to the Russian audience. He's trying to prepare them for the idea that, this is their narrative. We didn't succeed in Ukraine because we weren't fighting Ukraine. The Russian mentality towards Ukraine, in my experience of having lived here for a long time and encountered a lot of Russians over the years, and also, monitoring Russian media and being aware of the Russian propaganda that's coming out about Ukraine, I think, they fundamentally have a very, very difficult time accepting that Ukraine is a country, is a nation, is a separate nation, and they have, the Russians have a very deep inferiority complex toward Europe, toward the West. And they kind of project that back against the Ukrainians, say, okay, well, we look up to the Europeans, we look up to the West, which is why they fawn over every Z-list celebrity like Steven Seagal or Gérard Depardieu, or all these completely washed up stars in Russia. They celebrate them because they have such an inferiority complex about their own identity that they will praise anyone from the West who's prepared to say, well done, we respect you. But the other way they project that is by turning to the Ukrainians and sort of saying, well, you're not worthy of anything, you're our underlings, how dare you disobey us? And so it's very humiliating for the Russian psyche to be losing a war to Ukraine. It's deeply, deeply troubling for them, and I don't think they can deal with it. So their response is to always say, okay, we're not losing to Ukraine, we're losing to NATO, we're fighting NATO. And then it becomes a little bit more understandable, if not respectable. Then they think they're preparing the ground there to say, not necessarily for a defeat or even for a collapse, but perhaps for some form of imposed settlement on them, where they say, well, it didn't work out quite as we'd have liked, but we were fighting NATO, and we'll come back and fight them again, so it's not embarrassing for us. So I think, Solovyov here is really communicating with the Russian public rather than the European public. I don't think there's any interest in the Russians telling Europe we're going to fight you. On the contrary, if you look at Putin, he's constantly messaging to Europe, we're not going to fight you, because he wants to lower the level of readiness in Europe. He understands that it's very bad for Russia that Europe is now on the alert and saying we need to rearm fast, we're in trouble here because we've got this expansionist Russia here, we've got America retreating across the Atlantic, we need to rearm here in Europe fast because we're in trouble, and if Ukraine falls, we're next. So Putin's very, very clearly and repeatedly sending this message out to the European public saying, calm down, I'm never going to attack you, it's all propaganda, don't worry about it. So I think when Solovyov...
We've heard it and saw it.
So that's the Russian message. So Solovyov here is not trying to contradict Putin. I think he's trying to send a message via an international channel to the Russian public to say, guys, we're fighting NATO.
Peter, okay, let's imagine they will attack NATO countries. From what resources? Do they have any resources? Or it's going to be like a drone warfare?
I think we should, there's a real danger of looking at the war in Ukraine and saying, well, Russia's not made a lot of progress, therefore Russia is weak.
Yes.
That is very dangerous logic, Russia hasn't made a lot of progress in Ukraine because Ukraine is strong. Not because Russia is weak, but because Ukraine is strong. Also because Ukraine has received a lot of support from the West. But fundamentally, it's because Ukraine is strong, and also because Ukraine has made enormous sacrifices and suffered enormous losses, which also we must speak about as much as possible to emphasize to European audiences. This is Russia is nothing to be taken lightly here. They've caused devastation. They've committed terrible crimes, and they've caused, the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. Millions of people have been displaced. Entire cities have been destroyed. So this is a serious opponent. And if the Russians are not stopped in Ukraine, the threat to NATO will be even worse than it is now from Russia. Because if Russia were to establish themselves over Ukraine, then they have the Ukrainian army as well, or at least a large part of it, who would be pressed to serve with the Russians. Then you have Putin in control of the two largest armies in Europe against Europe, which is pretty much unarmed, partially unarmed, let's say, disarmed. The chances of him not going further, in my opinion, are very limited. I mean, I think it's delusional to think that he would put himself in such an advantageous position and then say, okay, I'm going to stop now. I think he's going to stop. I think he's going to go further. He would push it further. I think a war between NATO and Russia still looks unlikely, because Russia would very, very, very likely to lose that war very quickly. But what we could see, I think, would be some sort of border provocations, a type of a Donbass type operation like 2014, or a Crimean type operation, Little Green Men, something along those lines. Because the one thing that Putin has over the West, the one big advantage he has over the West, is he has political will. He's ready to use force, and the West is terrified of using force. And the West is constrained by the incredible caution, this escalation fear that really has hampered the Western response to the war in Ukraine. Now, they don't want to fight. They've been really reluctant to help Ukraine along the way. They've done a lot, but they've been sort of dragged every step of the way to help Ukraine, I would say. Now, in terms of defending themselves, I think they're even more reluctant, because they're really, you've got populations in Europe who've got no concept at all of what warfare is, thank God. And they really are not ready to deal with this. So Putin may look to exploit that. He may look to have some sort of a little operation here or there, with the goal of exposing NATO as basically an empty promise. It's basically exposing this collective security of NATO, and then once NATO's collective security is basically exposed in this manner, is shown to be a sham, then NATO itself stops to function, because NATO doesn't have any. NATO is just an agreement. NATO is only, the credibility of that collective, that Article 5. That's all NATO is. All it ever was.
I think Mark Rutte doesn't think so.
Well, Mark Rutte has his own opinions on many things, but I mean, I think if Germany, a lot of people in Europe are warning about the potential for some sort of a conflict with NATO. I think that those who dismiss that are missing the point. I think they're saying, well, there's no way that Russia, one thing I hear a lot is, come on, Russia can't even beat Ukraine. What threat is it to Europe? And that is really dangerous thinking, again, because Ukraine is far stronger than any other military in Europe, so that's one factor. And then the other factor is they don't have to defeat NATO. All they have to do is expose the fact that NATO will not live up to its collective security guarantees, and then NATO ceases to exist. And at that point, Putin has achieved a massive foreign policy goal. He can then sort of, piecemeal, make deals with all the different countries, the Baltic states first of all, then the Poles, and he'll come to them. That would be exactly, the dream of every Russian leader going back for decades now has been to separate America from Europe. That's arguably that's on the cards. It's not happened yet, but it wouldn't, it's moving in that direction. So again, that's something that Trump has been able to deliver for the Russians to a degree. And then the other great dream is to break up Europe's collective security and collectiveness in general. So break up NATO first and foremost, and then if possible also break up the European Union, and then do deals with everyone, and then Russia then becomes the dominant force over Europe.
Yeah, Peter, that definitely not optimistic. Okay, final one. Yeah, speaking about European Union, we have seen recently this hot and cold approach regarding the mediator from the Europe in negotiation process. There was a Schröder that Russia wanted. Then came up Angela Merkel, also the former Chancellor of Germany. The good figure is Alexander Stubb, the President of Finland. Is that very necessary for now at this point for Europeans to get into the process?
I mean, I think it's important for Europe to be part of the process, yeah. But I would say we need to be clear about what we're talking about here. You know, are we talking about Europe as a broker for peace? I don't think we can. Europe's clearly on Ukraine's side. There's no question about that, and we shouldn't. You know, there shouldn't be any question about that. You know, from a Ukrainian perspective, you don't want there to be a question about that. Europe is on Team Ukraine, so to speak. They are together, so they obviously can't play the role of neutral broker. And this was, I think, one of the mistakes that the Trump team made. That they tried to sort of position themselves as somehow this neutral brokers of a peace deal, when America, despite the fact that Trump has cut almost all aid to America, all aid to Ukraine, is still clearly on the Ukrainian side. Broadly speaking, they're providing intelligence support, they're selling weapons, you know, and so on. The sanctions imposed on Russia, you know, so they're not neutral. But they're a lot more neutral than Europe, you know. So Europe can't be part of this as an adjudicator. They should be part of it. They should definitely be involved. They should have a place at the table. We still need to look for someone who can play that role, can play that neutral role. I don't know. Again, China can't do it because they're too close to Russia. You know, so who plays that role? I think realistically, if you look at the world, it's going to be Turkey would be one. But Erdogan is a member of NATO. He could be potentially that figure. I think it might be somewhat, you know, it might be someone from the Middle East. Maybe we don't need a figure like that at all. So I think Europe should definitely be involved in the talks because Europe's future is at stake here. Europe's security is at stake. They should definitely be involved in discussing the broad settlement, because what we're talking about here, you know, for this to work, this is not just a deal between Russia and Ukraine. This should be a much broader international deal that guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty and security for the long term in a way that even the Russians have to recognise and accept. And that needs to involve a military presence from the Europeans in Ukraine. It needs to involve security guarantees from the United States and so on. You know, this is a big international deal, and it should also have a European component. So definitely Europe should be involved, but we shouldn't try and position it as Europe as a peacemaker or Europe as a broker, because that's nonsense. And frankly speaking, it's one of the few things I agree with the Russians on, that when they say, you know, they can't be. Yeah, that's logical. It is a fact. They shouldn't be. So we shouldn't try and position them as that. And it's the same in a way, again, of when we talk about the coalition of the willing and people talk about peacekeepers. They're not peacekeepers. They're supporting Ukraine. They're defending Ukraine. You know, so we shouldn't talk. We should definitely have those troops in Ukraine. We should definitely have.
I wouldn't love to.
Well, we should definitely have it. There's no question in my mind. But we shouldn't try and portray, you know, position them as peacekeepers, because that's foolish. They're not peacekeepers. They're defenders of Ukraine's sovereignty and of European security. And we should call them that. And we shouldn't be shy about calling them that. When we call them peacekeepers, we play into the Russians' hands, because then the Russians say, well, they're not neutral, are they? We don't allow it. We shouldn't do that. We should say, of course, they're not neutral. We don't want them to be neutral. We want them to protect against you.
Well, I've heard a lot of very aggressive comments on that issue from Europe. They just don't want to do that.
Well, some will, some won't. You know, there's not. Europe's a big word. You know, there's a lot of countries in Europe. There's a lot of different countries who will take part, who won't take part. I think the Baltic states, the Finns, they'll be in. The Poles probably not. The Brits, they'll be in. You know, there'll be different countries. Some of the Scandinavian nations will get involved. The Danish, the Swedes, I think. You know, there's enough people ready to get involved to make it a considerable force in Ukraine. You know, of course, there's a lot of question marks there. It would be a largely symbolic force, frankly speaking, because they're not going to fight Russia. I would put a much greater emphasis on an air mission to Ukraine to patrol the Ukrainian airspace, to get squadrons of fighters based in Ukraine, based on the borders of Ukraine, get more air defences in, you know, and to sort of set up a real a dome over Ukraine, as it were, defensive. Because I think that's much more realistic in terms from a military point of view. Although there are also many different details there to iron out. But nevertheless, yeah, we definitely need to have that sort of settlement. So the Europeans need to be involved in that, and they need to be involved in the negotiations. Again, you know, when Russia says, let's have Gerhard Schroeder as our representative with Europe, well, Gerhard Schroeder works for Russia. You know, Putin wants to talk to himself, basically. He wants to talk to the hand. You know, he wants to say, okay, what peace deal do you want? You know, Schroeder is his employee. He works for the Russians. He has done for decades. You know, so again, that's a signal of the Russian position on the peace talks. They're not ready to make peace talks yet.
But Abramovich was in Kyiv just recently. Maybe that's also the message.
Well, I mean, that was an interesting one. Yeah, that's interesting. Again, different messages about what he was doing here. You know, who invited him? Was he invited here? Was he sent by Putin? You know, a lot of different. Again, you know, there are signals coming through. I mean, I think, you know, the Russians understand that things aren't going well. They do understand that, and they are looking to find some sort of avenues, perhaps. But they're, you know, fundamentally, they're very, very far from than ready to agree to end the war on the terms now, because the terms now would be so bad for the Russians. They can't allow it. Putin probably wouldn't survive it, and he knows that, you know, so he's going to fight on if he can. But when we get to the point, so I think, you know, if we talk about Europe's role in this, if Europe wants to move this toward peace, they need to pressure Russia militarily and with sanctions, but primarily militarily. So they need to increase their military support for Ukraine. They need to demonstrate that Ukraine is going to stay in this fight for the long term, and they're not going to lose, you know, there's not going to be some change in politics in Europe and all of a sudden the support for Ukraine will stop, because that's what Putin is counting on. He's counting on outlasting the West, because the West is fickle, the West is weak, the West is corrupt, the West can be bought, you know, so they've got to send a clear message. That's not going to happen. Sorry, it's not going to work. We're in this for the long run, and they should be looking to increase the military pressure on Putin, and particularly to increase Ukraine's ability to bring the war home to Russia. And that is what I think is going to be the key to pushing Putin toward some sort of negotiations.
Peter, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, for your sharp mind and answers. And I hope the next time we will, if you're going to come, we will elaborate on the coalition of the willing and all the Ramstein meetings happening. Right now, the one is happening. So at this point, thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you.